This is the last week of 2023, and this is also our last political update for the year. Thanks so much for joining us here on the Atlanta News First streaming apps on YouTube and all of our streaming applications. I'm Tim Darnell, joined by political reporter Doug Reardon, and behind the scenes, as always, producer Maria Moreau. Doug, we're looking back at 2023. It's been an amazing year in terms of politics, historic in so many ways. Let's start off with Georgia saying goodbye to a beloved former First Lady of the United States, Roselyn Carter, passing away only a few weeks ago. A massive service held in Atlanta and a private memorial service in Plains. But this was the state and the nation saying goodbye to one of our most beloved citizens.
Yeah, no doubt, and certainly one of Georgia's favorite daughters as well. She was such a giant, not only in public policy, but also in her activism after they left the White House. I remember, I harken back to this quote all the time, Tim, where someone who we interviewed when Jimmy Carter entered hospice at the beginning of the year, who had written books on the Carters, he said that they were the only first family to do more good outside of the White House than they were able to do in it, and that is true time and time again as you look at some of the activism work they did. She passed away on November 19th as we were all getting ready to celebrate the Thanksgiving holiday. They had to put those services on hold until after that happened, but truly a wonderful show of recognition for a champion of women's rights, caretaker advocacy, mental health care, conservation in nature. She was also a very active part of her husband's administration. She would sit in on cabinet meetings, take notes, and consult with President Carter very often about some pretty big topics, including tensions in the Middle East. She had a big role in a foreign policy trip that yielded the Panama Canal. So she was very active and had her fingerprints all over Jimmy Carter's administration. She had a wonderful service at Emory University, which again was a huge partner with her and her husband in building the Carter Center, which would go on again to do so much good. Of course, all her work with Habitat for Humanity. It was a very sad day, but also a very uplifting one where at Emory we saw attendees ranging from former presidents all the way to every single living First Lady. And so definitely a wonderful send-off for someone who made a huge impact here in Georgia.
And let's talk about his partner for, or her partner for, over 70 years, the nation's 39th president, James Earl Carter Jr. He made a public appearance at her funeral here in Atlanta. And earlier this year, in February, as I recall, the Carter Center announced that he was entering hospice care. You traveled down to Plains along with many reporters the weekend after that announcement was made. Jimmy Carter would go on to celebrate his 99th birthday. What an amazing achievement and accomplishment. But he did make an appearance at Roselyn Carter's funeral, and now whether or not his passing is imminent or not, obviously time will tell, but his administration and his post-presidency has gotten a lot of national attention over the past couple of years.
Yeah, and maybe even more so after he entered hospice and as he continues to fight that all these months later. It's been almost a year now since we got that announcement that he was entering hospice and forgoing his battle with multiple different health issues. And so, it's still something that we are going to continue to keep an eye on and monitor and hope for the best in the new year. But it certainly was a really touching moment to see him come out. He was in a wheelchair, his legs covered in a blanket during that service at Emory, the first public time that he had been out since that announcement of hospice, except for one instance where he waved to folks from a car at the Plains Peanut Festival. But other than that, his hospice care has been incredibly private. He has communicated only through family, and so you have to imagine it was quite an effort for him to get out there to that funeral, but also something that he wouldn't have missed for the world, given that their relationship spanned over 77 years and was just really something to model after for such a long time.
Presidential politics has played such a huge role in our news cycle here in Georgia and Atlanta this year. One of the other major top stories that we were following and that you and I have both been reporting on digitally and broadcast, is the arrest and arraignment of the nation's 45th president, Donald John Trump. The State versus Donald John Trump is the title of the Fulton County indictment brought back earlier this year from Fulton County District Attorney Fonnie Willis. She indicted Donald Trump and 18 Republican allies in a massive organized crime-like, racketeering-like series of indictments on charges that the nation's 45th president and 18 of his GOP allies, including Mark Meadows, former White House Chief of Staff, Rudy Giuliani, former mayor of New York City, engaged in an alleged racketeering-like attempt to overturn Georgia's 2020 presidential election. Doug, nothing like this has ever happened in American history.
Yeah, there's no question at all in my mind that this was by far the biggest political story in Georgia, possibly the biggest political story in the entire nation this year, as Georgia finds itself again at the center of the political world heading into 2024 because of this case. We had that August indictment that was handed up to District Attorney Fonnie Willis late at night. It was about 11 o'clock when that indictment finally came out, and we got a chance to see it and hear from her on it. And then it was a couple weeks later where the former president and his motorcade came from the airport. They shut down the roads. He was able to get in swiftly to the Fulton County Jail and was through that booking process that sometimes takes hours for some in about 5 minutes. And then we got that scowling mugshot that is now the first and only ever mugshot of a sitting president or former president. And so it was really quite the moment when that was released to us and we were able to broadcast it out because of the historic nature of it, really a dark historic nature, depending on how you look at it. But certainly this is going to be another story that dominates in 2024. We still don't have a trial date yet. We expect it could happen sometime next summer, and so we're still a good ways out from that. But Trump is yet to set foot in an Atlanta or Fulton County courtroom yet, and that will be the interesting thing. When this trial happens, I need everyone to remember that it will be televised. It's not in federal court. It's in a local municipal court, superior court, and so it is going to be televised. And so we'll get a chance to really see the inner workings of this once we get a trial date, once it gets underway here. RICO was an interesting way to do this, and it was something that a lot of our experts and legal analysts had predicted might happen. RICO is typically reserved for organized crime, think the mob, some of the very crimes that Rudy Giuliani, who's charged in this case, got famous for prosecuting as a New York City prosecutor. But, in this case, they were claiming and still are claiming that there was some sort of coordinated, organized effort to overturn Georgia's election results. It all started with that phone call to Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger, where former President Trump had asked him to, and quote, find the exact amount of votes that he would have needed to beat Joe Biden by one here in the state in 2020. And so that was really the beginning moment of all this. And a couple years later, here we are now with 19 people charged. Some of them have already taken plea deals, including some high-profile names like Sidney Powell, one of the former president's attorneys. And so we expect maybe more might even come in the new year. So this is far from over. It's actually just getting started, even though we have been kind of doused in this since August when that indictment came up.
And all of this is developing as President Joe Biden, already the oldest president in U.S. history, is running for re-election, and his polling numbers, not only here in Georgia but across the nation, are just abysmal. We have seen poll after poll, first from CNN, showing Biden trailing Donald Trump here in Georgia by several points. Then another poll came out only a couple of weeks ago from the Morning Consult that was conducted on behalf of Bloomberg News, showing that Trump is quite comfortably ahead of Joe Biden here in Georgia by 8 points, I believe, as high as 11 or 12 points in Michigan and several other battleground states. There's no question Georgia's going to be a battleground state for 2024. But how does the White House or President Biden reconcile these really historically low poll numbers with continuing commitment to re-election?
Yeah, well, it's a tough thing to campaign and try and bring your poll numbers, bring your approval ratings up. I saw a Monmouth approval rating poll that had him at 34%, which is awful for any sitting president, of course. But what you have to do is you have to fix the issues that people care about, right? The economy is one that we know he's polling incredibly low on. Inflation is still near record highs, and so that's certainly something that people are hoping for a fix on. And he doesn't have a lot of time. I mean, the campaign season has already started, so the economy is a big issue, of course. Congress and the White House are still plagued by issues with Israel and Ukraine and divisions over who to support and how to fund those two separate conflicts that are really on the forefront of Americans' minds. You mentioned his age. He's 81 years old. That's another big thing that's keeping people from supporting him, despite the fact that former President Donald Trump, who's very likely to be the Republican nominee, is just about as old as he is. But he's really, just because of those primary issues, he's had a hard time kind of wooing the younger, more progressive section of the Democratic base, and that's going to be something he's going to have to focus on. How do you get younger people to come out and vote for you when the economy is really not favoring them, when you haven't really delivered on student loans, as you said you were going to at the beginning of your administration? So those are the things that really President Joe Biden's going to have to focus on probably in the next couple of months if he wants to bring these numbers up, especially in places like you mentioned in Michigan, Pennsylvania, Arizona, and Georgia, which are going to be these deciding states in 2024 when people go to the polls next summer.
Happening in the next couple of months. I didn't mean to cut you off, Doug, but you were saying things that the president will be focusing on in the next couple of months. In less than a couple of weeks, as a matter of fact, the Georgia General Assembly will convene in Atlanta. Let's look back on a couple of topics that the most recent General Assembly had to tackle, that being the redrawing of legislative and congressional maps. A federal judge threw out the previously drawn maps that happened back in 2021 as a result of the U.S. Census. And U.S. Federal Court Judge Stephen Jones ruled only a couple of weeks ago, I should say, that these maps were racially gerrymandered and were thus in violation of the 1965 Voting Rights Act. A special session was held back in November, where lawmakers were ordered by Governor Brian Kemp to come together and draw new legislative and congressional maps. And now what we're waiting on, and we're expecting to hear it, but hopefully by the end of the second week in January, whether or not these new maps are indeed constitutional or will be thrown out like the old ones.
Right, and one thing to note on the timeline, too, is the Secretary of State, who is the defendant in this case, because the Secretary of State's office runs elections, they had really asked for this to be speedy because they have to get ballots prepared for upcoming elections as well. They said February 12th is really the last day that we have to be able to finalize who's on these ballots and what district they're running in, because right now that's kind of up in the air until Judge Jones makes this decision. Now, what could happen here is he could approve the maps that were drawn up by a Republican majority, which of course has always existed in Georgia, but they scrambled into that special session at the end of November and into early December, drew those new maps up in accordance with the judge's orders that there had to be a number of majority black districts added in and around Metro Atlanta and in and around Metro Macon. So they came back to the judge and said, hey, we did it. We did what you asked. The problem, though, from the plaintiff side of this, the people who were suing the state over these maps, they were saying, yes, you did what the judge asked. You made these new majority black districts, but it doesn't add any power to the black vote as a block, because that was really the violation in the first place of the Voting Rights Act. Was they were doing what was called cracking and packing, where you're dividing up large groups of black constituents to dilute their voting power, and that was the issue at hand. And so the GOP majority came back and said, we did what you asked, here are the maps. Judge Jones can either now accept them, or he can say, you still have not cooperated with my ruling that there needs to be more power given the black voters in Georgia, and he can appoint a special master who's a nonpartisan mathematics expert who's going to look at these and draw them to the best of their abilities. To be fair, we've had almost 500,000 black voters move into the state of Georgia since 2010, the last census, but it really wasn't reflected in the maps that were drawn right at the end of 2021, I believe, as that census data was fresh and new. And so that was really the logic behind Judge Jones's Justice's decision here saying we've had a lot of black voters and constituents come into our state recently. We need to make that reflected in the voting maps. They have to be able to have the power to choose the candidates of their choice.
Judge Jones' ruling could come while the General Assembly is in session come January. The other issue that we were following very closely this past year, it wasn't a law that was actually adopted this year, but the heartbeat bill, the so-called heartbeat bill that prohibits in Georgia the abortion procedure from happening after approximately 6 weeks, which is what researchers believe is when a fetal heartbeat is first detected. That law went through the entire gamut of legal challenges and was only seemingly finally resolved earlier this year when a high court here in Georgia refused to throw out the bill, therefore upholding Georgia's 6-week ban on abortions. Yeah, this is just one of those social issues that has reverberated throughout the state and the nation for several years. Kind of talk us through what some of the legal ramifications of that ruling are.
Right. So here was the argument, right? For those who were against this 6-week heartbeat ban, the issue was really Roe versus Wade, because when this law was authored and adopted by Georgia lawmakers several years ago, Roe versus Wade was still the federal law of the land. It still guaranteed women access to abortion no matter what state they were in. And once that was overturned, of course, the power was given back to the state. So plaintiffs who were suing over this law and wanted it to be overturned were saying, well, it conflicted at the time it was written with the federal law, which you can't do. The Supreme Court here in Georgia came back after Roe was overturned and essentially said, well, it doesn't matter now because it's not federal law anymore, so we're going to uphold this 6-week abortion ban. So there is still an ongoing effort to get this overturned. Now plaintiffs will try and focus in the new year on privacy issues and a woman's access to privacy when it comes to getting an abortion. It could be even a more founded, more solid legal challenge to this than their original attempt, given that Roe has now been overturned. And so this is, again, going to be something that we keep an eye on in 2024 because it's far from over, even though that ban is in place right now. And something else, too, on the abortion front that's going to play a huge role here in Georgia is that Supreme Court, at the federal level, the Supreme Court deciding they want to take up the case of mifepristone, which is the abortion pill, which is responsible for well over half of the amount of abortions that we see every year here in the United States. They're going to rule on that sometime in the next year. And that could also have some pretty big and wide implications here in Georgia for women who want access to abortion care. Something else to look forward to and look ahead to in 2024.
It's moving right into 2024. Gosh, what do we have on the horizon? We have a potential trial for a former president of the United States. We have a Republican primary in March where Donald Trump is the presumptive nominee. We have the legislative session coming up from January through late March or perhaps early April, the trial of the former president, and a presidential election coming up roughly not quite less than a year from now.
Yeah.
What else do you think we're going to see in 2024?
Besides that, I don't know. It's good job security for political reporter in Georgia, though. Let's talk about some of the things that the state legislature could do, because obviously there's not a whole lot of control we have over those federal issues and the trial in Fulton County, but we certainly are just a couple days away from the start of the legislative session, and so there are a couple things that we're looking at that kind of rolled over from last year. They got enough votes to be tabled and taken up again. One of those is going to be a school voucher program where parents are going to be, if this passes, given stipends to move their kids out of public schools and into private schools or homeschooling education. That did not get the approval that it needed to become law last year, but it is certainly something that members of the GOP at the state level are really excited about. The fact that it's going to be there waiting for them again. I suppose the more progressive argument against it is that you're taking money away from public schools, and that was not something Democrats were interested in doing. And then there's the anti-Semitism bill, which is, of course, even more timely probably this session than it was last year, given the conflict in Gaza. And so what that would essentially do, it was brought to the floor by the only Jewish representative in Georgia, Representative Esther Panich from right outside of Atlanta. And what it would do is essentially for any acts and crimes that are committed that could be prosecuted by law, if there was an element of anti-Semitism to it, it would tack on a number of different punishments that could be associated with that part of whatever crime was committed. So you do graffiti on a synagogue, not only can you be charged for defacing a public property or something to that nature, but you can also have something having to do with anti-Semitism tacked onto it. It did not get the approval that it needed last year, and so it will be on the table again for lawmakers this year. Just a couple other things to run through. There's a cyberbullying bill that would hold social media sites accountable for this. That was brought just a couple weeks ago by the lieutenant governor to the limelight, something that he's going to try and push forward this session, as well as, speaking of the lieutenant governor, a bill that would pay teachers to be trained in firearms training and also theoretically be allowed to carry guns in schools. It's a school safety measure. It was incredibly controversial when he announced that he was going to be introducing it a couple months ago, and so we'll have to see how that one plays out too. I think it's something that really got people's attention when he announced it.
And that was one of the things we were going to mention. Lieutenant Governor Burt Jones, widely considered to be a possible Georgia gubernatorial candidate in 2026. Let's remember that Governor Brian Kemp is term limited, and his term will expire in 26. It will be a wide open gubernatorial race. Democrats, Republicans, I believe Attorney General Chris Carr has already semi-officially announced a candidacy. Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger, widely rumored to be a candidate, as well as the Lieutenant Governor Burt Jones. So this is going to be just a hugely important year, not only next year, but 2025 and 26 here in Atlanta and Georgia political coverage. We're so thankful that all of you have stayed with Atlanta News First throughout the year as we are continuing our efforts to bring you the latest political news and developments throughout Atlanta, Georgia, and the nation. Best wishes to everyone watching for a very happy, safe, and healthy 2024.